Welcome, everyone. Today we're moving into chapter 12 on the arts of ritual and daily life, as they're referred to in the chapter. And many times over the course of this lecture, you will hear me refer to the media on this list as craft media. And that is considering clay, glass, metal, wood, and fiber. And then at the end of the chapter, we've got some rare materials that are listed as well. But when we're considering these, what do they all have in common? Functionality is what I see with many of them. If we think about using clay, what we have used that material for thousands of years, or glass, or metal, or wood, and fiber included in that list, they are all things that have uses functionally in our daily life. With the ones at the top, clay and glass, I immediately think of vessels. You still use these when you are picking up a coffee mug made out of ceramic in your cabinet, or maybe a glass to pour some water into. The other materials have uses as well, functionally, in our day-to-day life. Thinking about metal and wood, using those to make tools and maybe hardware to put things together in the form of furniture. And then fiber is one of the most important to keep us warm. Thinking about using natural materials like for plants or from animals to be able to weave fibers that we can put on our bodies to insulate us from the elements, whether it be the blazing sun or the harsh winter wind. But fiber also has uses in day-to-day life. The last ones, ivory and jade and lacquer, we can see really being things that decorate not just our personal spaces like our homes, but also our bodies in the form of jewelry. And we think about decorating the body whenever we're talking about art and craft, but also considering decorative arts like these metal and wood and clay and glass were often used to, instead of just be creating a form of art like we see with sculpture and painting, the fine arts, they were considered to be on a higher pedestal than these other media that we're looking at, which have been termed for centuries the crafts. So what we see as we enter the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 1800s is a resurgence as machines start to take over the jobs of these craftsmen that they have had for not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years up to this point in our history. And we start to see an awareness of the handmade objects and traditional skills that we have been developing for thousands of years and their importance to our society. Because I'm sure many of you can tell the difference instantly between something that has been crafted by hand and something that was cranked out in the thousands by a machine. There's a very different feeling that those objects have to us, and oftentimes we treasure them because they were made with love by hand instead of just something cold in a factory cranked out by a machine. So let's get a time frame as far as where crafts begin to emerge. We see this for thousands of years prior to the first objects that were made to be art objects, those with a deeper meaning associated with them. But if we look back to the Paleolithic period prior to the Neolithic era that we're looking at here, we see craft medium begin to be practiced. Many of those at the top of the list that we were looking at as far as clay and glass and metal required the mastery of fire, because you had to be able to get the fire hot enough to harden the clay, make it undergo its chemical transformation from soft to a much more hard material. And the same with metal. We've got to be able to get the fire hot enough to melt the ore, melt down the stone source in the mineral form of that metal, and then be able to continue to refine it into its workable form. And that is true also for glass making. Very, very hot fires required to be able to make those. The most ancient of the three that we just mentioned is clay, and the history with ceramic craft going back at least 25,000 years up to this point. But other materials are going back further than that. If we think about fiber, making clothes for ourselves, or working wood, that goes back at least 150,000 years at this point. But the one we're going to start out with is clay. And ceramic is anything that we are making an object out of that is using clay as its form to begin with. And we discussed this briefly in the last chapter on sculpture, discussing how if you want to make a form, sculpture, even when we're working in bronze, we can originally start with a clay form that we make a mold around, make a rubber mold, and then be able to cast the metal into. Or you could just be forming that material out of ceramic and then firing it in a kiln. But that is the key here, that when we're starting with this material, it has plasticity, it is plastic, it is moldable and cohesive. So you can add to it, you can put more clay onto the form to build it up, and you can work it easily with your hands. That's why our history goes back so far with it. And when we're firing clay to make it undergo the chemical change to make it, instead of being plastic, be very hard and substantial, is putting it into a kiln or a fire that is in Fahrenheit ranging between 1200 and 2700 degrees, depending on the clay body that we're using in the beginning. So what I have for you here is a picture going back to ancient China, to the first emperor's tour around the country, illustrating what was going on in the clay center here, Guangzhou, where we saw that earlier in the video on Ai Weiwei and censorship. If you haven't watched that, you can find it in the announcements tab. But you can still see the ceramic in China being produced the same way today as it was thousands of years ago. In that video, we saw the water wheel powering this wooden ram that was just crushing the Patunce stone as it comes out of the mine into the powder that they're mixing with water and using to create this ceramic clay body. But in ancient times, the Chinese were very far ahead as far as their ceramic craft goes. So when we start looking at the history of ceramics in China, it goes back at least 20,000 years up to this point. But this one is a much more recent example we have coming from 2500 BCE. And we see, besides just the ability to form the clay body and fire it in a kiln and make that chemical transformation happen, we also see experimentation with glaze. So looking at the surface here, you have a mineral compound that has been painted onto the surface of the ceramic that can survive the high temperatures of that kiln. And once the ceramic comes out on the other side, the color is still evident. So this is an experimentation that we start to see expand across the region, thinking about the Silk Road and trade between the Far East and China and the Mediterranean region and Europe, looking at Egyptian ceramic here. In this case, we can also see evidence of the experimentation with glaze. We're finding mineral compositions that can survive the high temperature once placed into the fire of the kiln, and that will leave a lasting design on the surface of that clay body when it comes out. So this is evident as time goes on. This example coming from Greece, one of the very famous vessels that we have with the traditional style of using a black glaze to paint the entire pot and then scratch that away off of the surface to reveal the clay body below, where you're getting that red coloration there. So the entire vessel has been coated with glaze and then removed where you want that lighter pigmentation of the clay to appear. But going back to China, again, what we were looking at in that original image was the production of specifically porcelain, which is a type of clay body that has this white appearance. And we're being able to see not just the high shine of that glazed porcelain after it comes out of the kiln, but also the advances that the Chinese were undergoing as far as the production of glaze in different colors. So not just having a brown pigment like we see coming from mineral compounds with the former ceramic vessels from Egypt and from earlier centuries in China, but in this case seeing a lot of chemical experimentation going on to be able to produce those vibrant reds and pinks and greens that we see in this floral depiction on the surface of the ceramic vessel here. This is a more traditional porcelain glaze that we see coming from the region. This one also coming from China in the Ming Dynasty. So this is still seen today. If any of your family members collect porcelain, dinnerware in the form of plates or bowls, I know that my mother is really into blue willow china, and all you see in that decoration is the blue glaze on white ceramic and no other colors represented. So here is a form coming from North America, where we have First Nations example, Maria and Julia Martinez, that are making a traditional blackware glaze that you can see on this vessel. So the clay body itself is black, and then having this contrast with a slightly lighter value of gray in the glaze there. But it's very attractive in its own right. What we see in the 21st century start to happen after this arts and crafts movement is artists who are working with their craft medium, that being ceramics, are kind of starting to ask questions like, what is separating me from being on that higher pedestal of fine art? Peter Voulkos was one of the main ones we see with ceramic medium pushing in that direction in the latter half of the 20th century, but his main argument being, if you're using ceramic to make sculpture and I'm using ceramic to make a craft object, what is really separating us from being on that higher platform? And he had various colleagues that were of the same mind. Paul Soldner here, where you can see just trying to experiment with sculptural form with ceramic as a medium, and saying, well, why is this a craft object just because I, as a ceramicist, made it out of clay instead of someone that was considered sculptor making it out of clay? Here's a Robert Arneson here, where he's obviously going in the sculptural direction here, human figurative sculpture, and executing it very successfully, and trying to, again, push that prerogative that they have of trying to equalize that separation between fine arts and the crafts. So here's a Betty Woodman, again, working very sculpturally, more painterly even, in the way that she's using her glaze. It almost looks like it could be an Henri Matisse from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. Marit Ramusin here, who is also using sculptural exploration as the main means to make this clay body work for her piece here. So you've got some stoneware clay, and it's been colored with a slip that has been pigmented in this case. When we look at traditional Chinese and Japanese ceramics, we still have a rich history of preserving the original ways of making and traditional ceramics, using them to make cups and bowls to eat and drink out of. But we also see in the 21st century the exploration of using that craft medium as a material to make sculpture with, and trying to build on the work that we have a lot of artists of the 20th century fighting to blur that line in between the fine arts and the craft medium. So what we'll really be going over, besides just the history of each one of these materials, is a list of techniques for how to work these materials. If you want to explore ceramics as far as a medium for yourself, contact Jackie Brown, who is our resident ceramics professor. And if you don't have room to be able to fit it into your schedule, you can always try to sign up for the community ceramics class that is offered every semester, and she can give you more information about that also. But when you go over into our ceramic studio, you'll see a lot of these same tools. We have a slab roller, and it looks much like a printmaking press in that you have a cylinder here that you are rolling your clay body underneath to flatten it out. You could also just do it in a more simple method by using a rolling pin, as you can see over on this side. But slab construction is nothing more than making a flat piece of clay that you can begin to fabricate your work out of. And you can see some objects that have been made with that method. Slab-built ceramics can be used to make vessels, as you can see in the form over here, where you have a hollow form that has a lid on top of it there. You could also use it to slump, as in rolling out that form and then just dropping it, as we see on the table here, to make that sculptural form. Or you could slump it over an object, in this case using a bowl to be able to slump those large sheets of ceramic over, and then being able to make that form here. You could also roll it out flat and carve it, and I'm sure many of you might have done that, like we see in this piece here, going in and carving into that flat ceramic to make a design. Coiling is another method that we have for construction, and you are making coils out of these little snakes of ceramic that you're rolling out by hand. And what's going on with this is, if you were going to make a cylindrical vessel, you would just make a circle and then make another circle and stack them on top of each other to start to create that form. So what you can see here is some of those coils in process being built. So the coil will be added, and then you're going in and smoothing out the coil into the clay body itself, and then building up the form that way, one layer at a time. So as you start to build those coils up and smooth them out, you can build mass, and it will be hollow. So here's some examples of some coil-built ceramics. There's nothing to stop this construction method leading to a sculptural object in the end. As we can see here, many of them, after they have been built in coil form, have then been carved to add texture, or using glaze to add color to the presence of that form. Or, this is another method, the pinch method. So it's what it sounds like. You are pinching the ceramic. You're starting with a ball, and then sticking one thumb into there, you're opening that form up and then starting to push the sidewalls up. And it's usually made or used to make smaller vessels. There's a limitation with how big you can get with this method without having to start to add coils and build in that way. But you can see that with most of these objects, they have resulted in smaller vessel forms that have been pinch constructed. And then you could also go back in after you've established your form and start to apply texture with a stamp or carving, and also adding color with glaze like we can see here. So the real advancement that comes in the ceramic world is the potter's wheel, and we see this appearing just over 4,000 years ago. And with the potter's wheel, you're using centrifugal force in this large wheel, as we can see, to create repetitious form. So when the clay body is spinning, you can use your hands to make a radially symmetric form. And you can see this guy here that is working his potter's wheel, and he's using one that he's driving with a stick, and then being able to grasp the top of that and pull the form of a cup off of it. And he's really, really efficient at it. So he's able to crank out many, many vessels that are almost identical using the potter. If you are planning to take a ceramics class in our ceramics studio at Frostburg, you'll probably use a potter's wheel that's more like this, that instead of having a foot drive or a stick drive, as we see over in the image on the left, it has an electric motor and a pedal that you might be able to see just below the potter's wheel there. So you can control the speed very effectively and produce your vessels in a very, very symmetrical way. There's a couple of them, as you can see, on the bench off to the side of the potter's wheel, but this is one of our students in action, being able to raise that vessel out of the clay body. So centering it on the wheel and then using your hands to start to pull that form upward. And then as you pull the form upward, you can also start to open it. So this is spinning quite quickly, and you've got to keep it wet to keep your friction coefficient down while you are working the material, and also you don't want to dry your clay body out that is water-based, but opening that form up and then pulling up walls. So you can see this as the pot starts to develop, you're pulling that wall up higher and higher. And then you can start to add form to this. So pushing the walls out, bringing the lip further out also, and you can have a lot of control over this as you're creating this vessel, and you can change it, keep manipulating that material while it's soft until you get to the form that you want, and then you will stop and remove it from the wheel. So this is a couple that produces ceramic works together, Dries Verbruggen and Claire Warnier. They are a Belgian couple, and I took a class when I was in grad school from them on digital fabrication methods. And what we see here is their method of producing ceramic objects that they've developed that is in the same line as 3D printing. So instead of how a 3D printer works, extruding a plastic filament that it's melting, in this case they're using pneumatic pressure to extrude a clay body out of this little nozzle. So as the printer head moves around, you can see it's starting to build those forms up, and then it can even fill in the interiors and make a mesh just like a 3D printer would to be able to create these ceramic forms. And what I find so attractive about those forms is their lightness. They're much lighter than when you're working one of these clay bodies by hand and working it on a potter's wheel or with your hands in a pinch pot or a coiling method. But we have a few different clay bodies here, brown stoneware, white stoneware, and porcelain, like we discussed earlier. We looked at some examples from ancient Egypt and ancient China. But in this case, we're talking about the temperature that is needed to be able to fire these. So high fire is what it sounds like. You need a much hotter fire to be able to get that to function and undergo that chemical change. The low fire is just what it sounds like. You are using a much lower temperature in that kiln to be able to get that ceramic body to undergo the chemical change. So terracotta being one of the ones that is more on the low fire end of the spectrum. And I'm not going to grill you on this on the final exam at all. I just want you to know that high fires, higher temperature, low fires, lower temperature, and that we are using, in this case, pyrometric cones to be able to fire these clay bodies. So in this case, when you're using a ceramic kiln, you will be always having the temperature display on the outside in the form of maybe an analog thermometer where you have a needle that is displaying the temperature inside, or on the more modern ones, you'll have a digital display with your pyrometer displaying how hot it is inside the kiln. But when we're working with ceramics, it's just like when you're baking cookies. Like sometimes if you put it like on the bottom rack, the cookies will burn. It'll be a different temperature on the bottom or at some different part of the kiln than it will be on the interior. So we use pyrometric cones. And in this slide, you can see one before it's fired, and then after it's fired, they have started to bend over, and they will show us the exact temperature inside the kiln. This is the glaze room at Frostburg, where you can see all of your different chemicals that we have to be able to make color appear on the surface of ceramic objects. And oftentimes these formulas are quite complex. This is my colleague Eric Kempler's recipe for the ceramic object that you can see here. She's got all this brilliant blue and green, but you can see all the different things that she put into that formula to be able to get the surface to look like it does. I'm sure a lot of that blue is coming from the cobalt oxide in there. I'm not an expert, but usually the blue is coming from cobalt chemical composition. And you can use all of these different kinds of kilns at our ceramics area in Frostburg. We have electric kilns, gas kilns, and then we're going to talk about some other process of firing using soda, wood, or the raku process. But here are electric kilns, and this is nothing more than a toaster oven on steroids. You have the same type of deal. You have an element of metal moving through a ceramic shield wall that is, once an electric current is passed through that element, it gets hot, just like your toaster does. And it can get really hot in the case of some of these ceramics needing to go closer to 2,700 degrees. So you could use electric. You could also use gas, just like you do, and depending on what your home runs on, using gas to be able to go in and blast those ceramic vessels with flame and then make sure that they are attaining that temperature that they need to undergo their chemical change. The soda kiln looks like a tomb, and it's in the building directly next to the art building where we normally meet. And the soda kiln is made of brick, and you can see we're stacking the vessels that we're going to fire up on shelves of ceramic on the inside. And then what happens when you turn the gas on, you'll start to blast that soda into the port there, and it just gives a different look to the surface glaze on those ceramic objects. We also have outside on our kiln pad that's just up the hill up by Edgewood, we have a wood fire kiln, and you can see, hopefully I see this over here, the flame of the wood fire coming out of the top of there. And this is a process that needs to run for an extended period of time, so people have to take shifts stacking or stalking that flame and making sure that the kiln is maintaining the temperature that it needs to fire the ceramics. So see some students here putting their wood into the fire to maintain that temperature. But we can also see when we're unloading this that no room was wasted at all, because you're having to use a lot of wood to be able to get this firing process to work. So you want to make sure that you have as many vessels in there as you possibly can to make it the most efficient that you can possibly perform there, just so you're not wasting materials. With raku, as far as this process is concerned, it's a reduction firing. So you are trying to keep all the oxygen out of that firing environment. So here we have those vessels being immersed in some shredded paper. So you're keeping the vessel without oxygen, high carbon dioxide. If you keep the oxygen away from it, Here's those vessels getting quenched off afterwards. You can really attain some incredibly beautiful ceramic glaze finishes. So achieving this almost metallic reflective look that you can see coming off the surface there, which I'm certain that is coming from that copper carbonate. So you can see what it did. It really just made copper present on the surface of that glaze there. The next medium we want to discuss is glass. And just like with ceramic, you probably still have an example of this in your kitchen today, using ceramic to make the common coffee mug and glass to make various drinking vessels that are pleasurable to drink out of. And this is another medium that goes back thousands of years up to this point, getting close to 5,000 at this point. And so we can see an example from ancient Egypt here. We've looked at this slide earlier in the drawing chapter in chapter 6, where we were examining a piece of papyrus, the paper that we were discussing drawing taking place on. But here we can see in the subject matter the children here playing with marbles, an ancient game using glass spheres. And we have a archaeological record also of ancient Egyptian vessel making using glass. This one being constructed in a method similar to the lost wax casting method that we were discussing in the previous chapter, where you are making a sand core and then wrapping this sheet of molten glass around it and closing the vessel off at the top here, or tightening that opening so that you can serve, in this case, pomegranate juice out of that vessel. But I also want you to take note of the fact that even in ancient times, they're experimenting with chemistry, just like with ceramic glaze, putting different chemical compounds into the glass to be able to change the color, to be able to get these greens and yellows and whites and blues out of the ceramic vessel itself. What we have in Europe is a history of working glass in a very different way. Instead of making vessels, trying to create imagery in the way of cutting glass in sheets, forming shapes, and then attaching those together with strips of lead. So we'll see a lot more of this once we get into the last chapter on architecture. This is the cathedral at Chartres in France, and this was 1150 to 1170 CE. So you can see the date range on that. The cathedral itself is taking 20 years to construct, and no expense was spared. They are using the skills of these artisans here to make an incredible display in the stained glass. And you might have seen examples of these before. It's very common to see this in the art of Christianity, with depictions of various characters from biblical tales, but also we see that in a structure that we looked at earlier in the semester also, which is the Great Mosque at Cordoba in Spain, where you're also seeing a stunning example of stained glass with Islamic art. So a name that you will probably see again come time the exam is Louis Comfort Tiffany. We've looked at his wares before also from Tiffany & Company, a massive shop with many artisans that were employed there. But we talked about organic form earlier in the semester in chapter 4, and we looked at a Louis Comfort Tiffany vase. But I also want you to consider the stained glass art that Tiffany & Company engaged in the beginning of the 20th century. We have some stunning examples, in this case also, of stained glass being connected with those lead strips. So anywhere that you see these black lines separating the pieces of glass, that's where the lead is. But what they were experimenting with was mixing chemicals into the glass so that in one continuous panel you could almost begin to paint with that material. So it was an advancement for the time. You might also see in your studies history of Tiffany and Company. They now do a lot of jewelry, but back then they were doing craft objects to decorate the home. So stained glass, again, being used in this one. We've got a cast bronze base, so using lost wax to make that tree trunk at the bottom, and then connecting all of these little pieces of glass and locking those together with lead. So it just really goes to show Tiffany's love for shining light through colored glass and the effect that it could produce. So what we see here, a 20th century example of glass work by Tutzinski. You have a glass creation that could have been a bowl to sit on a table or maybe a plant pot, but he's gone and squished it. This is something, again, that we see a lot happening in the 20th century, where you have artists that are working with craft medium beginning to push away from the traditional way of making these works. And instead of just making a vessel, they're trying to push that form and turn it into a sculptural object. And in this case, again, we have a vase by Harvey Littleton that he has gone back in and melted and allowed to just misform and turn into an object that arguably is a lot more interesting to examine visually than a regular old vase. So here's another Harvey Littleton for you, experimenting with the ways that that molten glass, as it forms over on itself, can make a very interesting form that has no functional purpose, like the form of a drinking vessel made out of glass does. Here's a Marcus Ammerman here, his glass horse mask from 2008. You can see some slump forming of that molten glass that has been colored with multiple chemical compositions here to change that appearance. And in the chapter, they give you this example of Fred Wilson's Iago's Iago's mirror that is Murano glass. And I wanted to take note of this with you because Murano glass is from the island of Murano, and this is not a great example of that type of glass. With Murano glass, it does not just usually have one color like this. They're famous for making glass for centuries now that has lots and lots of color in it. And you can see the island of Murano here off the coast of Italy. And here is some of those types of glass. You can see many, many colors in this that have been added to give you all of that visual presence. And we have a tradition of that in the United States, making glassware that is very colorful. And with some of these examples, like this one from the Illusions of Glass Gallery in Denver, they are sometimes considered to be illicit, depending on the function that those glass vessels have. So you might be able to guess by examining this one what it is being used for in an illicit sense. But I want to direct your attention especially to Dale Chihuly. I'm going to put one video link up for you on his work, and he's arguably one of the most famous glass workers that we have. One of your contemporaries. He's still alive and making work today, and his glass works are incredible. He started out making works that were much smaller, vessel forms, as we can see here. He's the one with the yellow pants and the eye patch. He still does not have the use of one of his eyes, but his installations are quite incredible. Some of them in gallery spaces or public exhibition areas, but many of them he has produced with the aid of the botanical gardens of North America, where he's gone all over the country and produced glass works, him and his team, which is composed of dozens of glass workers in these botanical gardens. One of them here in Pittsburgh, the closest one, the last time that they installed there. But trying to make some of these glass forms resemble the flora that is surrounding them. So this is in the rainforest room, and he's getting inspired by the structures of the plants themselves, having these little vines or tendrils coming off of their flowers. This was another one down south. This one was in the Phoenix Botanical Gardens originally, and he was trying to mimic the form of agaves or Joshua trees, where you have very spiky forms that start to emerge when you're exposed to the flora of the southwestern United States. So the next media on our list in the crafts is metal. And I'm sure you can think of many objects in your daily life that are made of metal, but that history goes back thousands of years also. One of the methods for constructing something out of metal that we have already talked about is casting in the last chapter on sculpture, making some form of mold that, in the case of lost wax casting, you would melt the wax out and then pour the metal into the heated mold. We also want to discuss forging and talk about how that works a little bit, but that is the other method of making objects out of metal that has gained quite a lot of popularity over the last decade or so, with shows like Forged in Fire coming on the History Channel and talking about forging. But with casting, I hope you all have gotten a grasp on that at this point, that this object, this aquamanile, which is a vessel, it's hollow inside, and water would have been placed into it and blessed and then could be used at ceremonial occasions. But this object was produced with lost wax. The mold was constructed around the wax object in its original form, in this case using clay and sand to create that mold material, which was heated, and then the wax would burn out, and then you would continue to heat the object or the mold object and then pour the liquid Latin alloy, as they talk about in this chapter, but that is essentially a bronze, using copper and tin to produce this gold colored metal. So when we're talking about forging, we're not talking about making an object and burning the original wax out and then casting metal into the mold. We're just talking about refining metal and then using hammers to be able to shape it. So you know that metal is not like ceramic whenever it's in its raw form. It is not malleable and you can't work it with your hands. It's hard. Where it comes from initially is out of ores, mineral compounds that we find in the earth that we can heat and then have the metal refining process begin. And oftentimes that would require repeated forgings or repeated smeltings in the early stages before you could start forging. So if you got some copper ore, you would need to heat it, get some rough copper out of it, then put all that rough copper that you gathered back into the fire and keep on extracting impurities from it until you got to a form that would stay together and that you could hit and forge with the hammer and manipulate. So when we advance throughout history, our tools for being able to manipulate metal become more advanced. If you're looking at a traditional blacksmith shop, you would see something like this, where you have a hearth that you would place coal into, and then you would use the bellows, this pump, to be able to force air into your fire to be able to make it very hot. There's some other traditional tools, the hammers and tongs over here, that we're using to be able to hit the metal or be able to hold it while it's very hot. You've also got an anvil, which you might have seen in Looney Tunes or other cartoons being dropped on someone's head. That would not be a thing that you wanted to do with an anvil. The one that I have in my studio is 105 pounds, and it would definitely be fatal. But we've got some other tools here, swage blocks to form the metal on, or various top tools to be able to hammer over and form the metal. But it's tricky. With coal, it burns very, very hot, and you have a risk of just, even if it's steel, just melting that piece completely off and then having nothing left of it. When I work with steel, I like to use a forge that is running off of gas so that you can get up to this temperature, red hot, that you need the metal to be able to manipulate it, but you don't run the risk as much of completely melting that metal off. It'll just look like a sparkler in the form of ferrous metal, like with hot forging here, like we see in blacksmithing. But we also want to talk about non-ferrous metals, that being metals that do not have iron in them. So either iron or steel, which is 99% iron and 1% carbon. We have to forge those metals hot. So they will glow like this and put off a lot of energy from that heat that they achieve. So this is happening somewhere in the range of 2,500 degrees. With non-ferrous metals like silver or copper or gold, tin, what have you, there's a list of them. You can look at the periodic table for that, but you are not needing to heat those up when you're forging them. You do that cold, but you do still need to heat. So throughout each one of these processes, starting with the rough piece of silver stock that we have here, we start to hammer on it. So hammering the sides out and starting to form this spoon. And whenever you are hammering, you are hardening, and you must go back in and anneal. So what is going on with that is you're heating the metal up to over 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and then all of those molecules that were hardened whenever you're hammering them relax and it becomes soft again, and you can start to hit it again. So going back in through multiple courses, heating and annealing, and then doing more hammering, cold forging, and roughing out this shape until you get closer to the form of the final object. So I'm going to put up another, it's Craft in America that PBS puts out, that is a link to another extra credit assignment for you, which will discuss this annealing and cold forging process, because I think it's sometimes trickier until you see someone do it to understand than the hot forging process of blacksmithing. That's pretty intuitive, I think, heating the metal up and then it relaxing and able to move. But we can do a lot of things with metal. We can fabricate it, cutting out flattened shapes and then putting those together like we would with wood. But I want to discuss a couple others that might not be as familiar to you. Raising, chasing and repoussé, enameling, putting glass onto the metal, granulation, and filigree. So with fabrication, I mean, that's our very basic form. This is what I do with a lot of my works. I use very tiny jeweler saws, like you can see here, where you have a blade that you almost cannot see the teeth on. It's so fine. And I've got a piece of copper here just going through and cutting out a shape. And then you can start to assemble that. So in this one, you can see the base plate and then the walls of this vessel. And then I've fluxed it to keep the oxygen out of my joint that I'm completing with solder. And this is a silver solder. These little beads here are going to melt along this edge and then connect those. So here's the bottom plate, and then I've got steel wires wrapped around to bind it down to that base plate, and then I'm going to solder on the hinge structure over here. So this vessel ended up sliding open sideways, but all of those pieces have to be connected together. If you were doing this out of steel, you'd be welding. If you're doing non-ferrous metals like copper, gold, or silver, you're going to be doing that with solder. The next technique I want to talk to you all about is raising, and that is different from fabrication, because instead of like cutting out the shapes like the walls of the vessel or the base or the top, In this case, you're forming that metal out of one sheet. So this piece that we have here is starting from one flat sheet of copper. And as you start to hammer it, you're raising the walls of that vessel up. So like in this one that we see here, you're in process, like you've had to anneal it, had to heat it with the torch and relax the molecules again so that you could continue to raise it up. And after many passes of annealing, you can arrive at a vessel like this that is out of one sheet of metal. This is not like a cylinder that was formed. You're taking an original form like this and forming those walls higher and higher until you have formed it to this place. So metal is malleable, but you do need to heat it intermittently in these non-ferrous forms to be able to make it be willing to move. And these are the types of tools that we use to be able to form those metal objects in that way, using various stakes or hammers to be able to form the metal over. The next technique we want to talk about is chasing and repoussé, and that is hammering in the impression of an image into the metal. The chasing is hammering from the back side of the metal, and then the repoussé work in this term is going back in and adding the details from the front side. So how this is accomplished is with a substance called pitch. So we'll have a pitch bowl, as you can see here, and it's a very sticky substance, kind of like tar, that you will place your metal sheet down. Here's a piece of copper in it, or silver, whatever non-ferrous metal you're using to do this process with, and trap it into the pitch. So push it over the edges and then make it so that this piece of metal is locked in there. And once you heat it with a torch, it gets very soft, and then you'll let it harden again, and you can start to then hammer into this substance. So you can see the impression, the object here that has just been flipped over, it was face down in this part of the pitch right here. And what you do is go in with your steel tools, this thing, various shapes, round ones or square ones, whatever impression you want to make, and hammer in those details into the pitch. So when you start to form this, you flip it to the other side and you can repoussé and put in all the detailed work. So here is one of your contemporaries, also David Wong, who does copper raising. So he's raised this whole vessel up out of one sheet and then fills it with pitch and does the chasing and repoussé, and then he lines the entire part of it with gold. And I mean, these are very expensive vessels if you end up going and buying those. So here we've got granulation, which is our next technique that we want to look at, and this is merely putting these little granules, the little beads of metal, onto the surface, and that is also accomplished through heat and a chemical that you're putting copper sulfate onto the surface of this metal. This is done with gold. It can be done with silver also, but I didn't think that the example that your book gives you is a very impressive example. You can see their earrings, but I just don't like the forms themselves. The granules, when you form those, if you're working with metal and you start to heat it, its natural state, once you get it to a point of being molten with the torch here, is to just suck up into a little sphere. So these are some jump rings, taking apart some gold necklace chain links, and then as soon as you heat it with the torch and get it molten, it will just turn into one of these little liquid metal balls of gold. And then you can start to go in and arrange those on the surface. And this is a process that it originated in the Mediterranean with the Etruscans, and then some presence in Greece and Rome after that culture. But this is painstaking. I mean, positioning all of these pieces of gold beads of gold onto your jewelry, and then having the copper sulfate bond them to the surface whenever you heat it. But you've just got to hit the right temperature, because if you heat it too high and melt the whole thing, then your design is gone. But I saw a demo from Kent Ribley, who is arguably one of the leading North American goldsmiths that specializes in granulation, and you can see some of his pieces here. These are rings, so you can see how tiny each one of these little gold beads is. But they are also incredibly expensive, as you can see a lot of diamonds and precious gems, pearl, what have you, in with that gold granulation. Here's just another couple of his pieces that I wanted to include for you to see some of that granulation in process. But granulation just refers to arranging all of your little beads of gold or silver onto the surface. So it does create an actual texture. Enameling, also one that I think is underplayed in the chapter here on craft, medium, and metal. We also have a rich history of for thousands of years, because we've been working glass and metal alongside each other for a long time. But if we're using non-ferrous metals, they have a much lower temperature than steel, and we can find glass compounds that will melt at lower temperatures also and bond them to the surface. This is one that they give you an image of, but we've also looked at enamels on metal in the past in this semester. If you remember back to the Mask of Tutankhamun, all of the color here, the red and the blue on the mask, is glass. It has been molten and bonded with the gold of the mask itself. And again, this process is tricky. Even for me to do today with a kiln that has a pyrometer on there giving me the exact temperature, I have an idea of where I'm at, and there was no pyrometer back then. You had to make sure that you got to that exact temperature so that the glass would bond with the gold and not melt your entire form. So these are some works. I really regret that we're not able to meet face to face right now, because I always bring these in and let you guys try them on if you really want to. They're my belt buckles that I have made using enamels. So all the color that you see is either coming from stones being set into those belt buckles, or in the case of like the surface colors here, this is all glass that has just been bonded through the heat of the kiln to the copper below. So they all have belt buckles, and we'll talk about Mokame Gane and Damascus steel again here too, because anytime you're doing pattern welding of steel, Damascus, you can also hear it sometimes called pattern welded steel, but you have an example of different layers of metal that have been welded together in this case. So with regard to Japanese swordsmithing, they are folding this metal. With Damascus, sometimes you will just go back in and weld those layers together and then keep forging them out. And as you stack them and reforge them, you're multiplying the layers every time. So this one, I believe, was 384 layers of steel that then grind down and etch with an acid and then blacken, so that when we polish the surface, the low-lying areas will stay black and the high areas will be polished and be raw steel. So you can see the pattern of what happens in that metal. And when you do it with non-ferrous metals like copper, nickel, gold, silver, brass, bronze alloys, this is referred to as Mokame Gane. And the same thing is happening. You're stacking layers of metal, and then in this case I go in with drill bits and manipulate the the metal surface. So I've gone in and drilled and then flattened and then drilled and flattened, and it's bringing that pattern up to the surface. So what you're seeing in those holes is layers going down through that billet of metal that are corresponding to the layers that were placed in it. So this one was copper and silver. So we've got some examples of enameling here. We did just discuss that. It's very popular in the beginning of the 20th century. But a couple more forms of enameling. Cloisonné, which is a French term, but the cloisons are building up these little individual cells. So what you'll do is have thin sheets of gold or silver and make walls that will hold in the different colors. So these glass colors don't bleed together and make the design sort of mucky looking. You want to keep those colors separate. So you build these little vertical walls of gold and silver, and that's what we're seeing in this piece here. There's some other things like stone setting. We've set some opal and diamond in this gold, but all of these little cloisons or sections have been then packed with glass and fired before the stone setting takes place. But the opportunities with enameling are endless. I mean, champlavé here, we can etch the metal like we talked about with printmaking, put it in acid and resist certain areas so that when you stick it in the acid, you will have low-lying areas that you can then pack with the powdered glass and then fire and have your design in glass preserved in those low-lying areas and create a very beautiful design here on silver. This is another French origin method here, plique à jour, which is where you're actually cutting out holes. Instead of just etching your design into the metal to make low-lying areas, you are piercing out those areas entirely and then packing them with glass and then firing it so that when you hold this up to light, this little serpent pendant here, you would be able to see the light coming through that glass, almost like the stained glass that we were looking at in the cathedrals of France earlier. But the last one of these techniques is filigree here that I want to talk about. It could refer to many different types of decorative design. It could be filigree in the case of these carvings here that you would have in wood, but we're talking about specifically filigree in metal, which is something that you can do with wire that has been rolled out very fine in gold or silver or copper, and make jewelry or other vessels with this type of wire. So you can see the framework here, some thicker wire that's then being packed with a much finer detailed wire in silver or gold. This one is coming from the Russian Orthodox tradition. It's a little reliquary where we have silver filigree that has been used to create the entire form of that box, and it's truly beautiful, very, very detailed in its work. And again, this is where I regret that we're not meeting face to face, because I always bring in all of my filigree work for you guys to see and handle, and you can feel how light and airy it is. But this was a little tea infuser that you can also see on my website, which has some silver filigree in this vessel form. And this is another one of my pieces where I've got some filigree locking this cassette tape into the necklace. So here's just one more of those works, just a piece of jewelry that I'm using filigree in this silver to make that form in the bottom there. And these ones also, forgot those, the lockets. So these are just little necklaces, and you can open them up and put little treasures inside there. So one of the oldest craft medium that we have on the list is wood. The Smithsonian having objects that have been dated to around 400,000 years ago, which makes it one of the longest worked materials that we have. And while it does serve as a fuel, if you burn it, you don't need fire to work it. You can have other harder materials like stone that can be used to carve into it, and we've found many uses over the millennia for this versatile material. It is renewable, so it will come back if seedlings have been planted, and it can be manipulated in a number of ways, carving being the most ancient, but processing and then assembly, or we can even turn it in a radially symmetrical fashion, just like the potter's wheel in ceramics. So here's an example that we have from the chapter that is going back to 2575 BCE from ancient Egypt. And the other thing to note about wood is that it is vulnerable to deterioration over time if it is exposed to the elements. So thinking about wood getting wet and then starting to rot, or invasive species like termites getting in and eating away at the material itself, or most of all, fire. If that gets into contact, you know exactly what happens to wooden objects. They do burn up and are then nothing more than carbon in their place. So ancient Egypt is where we see a lot of wooden artifacts that are very well preserved, like this chair here, which is a prime example of what the Egyptians were doing, making components out of wood and then assembling those together. And in this example, it's being decorated in the surface by adding gold leaf to really elevate the level of chair. It's not just a stool. This is getting towards the chair as it has also been used for thousands of years to make thrones or a seat for someone of importance. So the tradition of carving wood and assembling it is strong in northern Africa, where we have the Egyptian Empire. But as we expand throughout the continent, we saw many examples in the last chapter of carved wooden sculpture, figurative sculpture specifically coming from Central Africa, and also vessel making. So as you can see with this piece, when we look into the center portion here, this has got a lid which is separate, and then this portion is the vessel where things are placed inside. With regard to carving wood, once we get into the post-industrial period, in the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, when this piece was produced by Gustav Stickley, he was an author and was also writing about what was happening at the time with regard to craft materials and their production in the arts and crafts movement after the Industrial Revolution had reached its height. And he noted that there was a difference between the things that were being produced on assembly lines in a factory, much of which, with the help of machinery, became readily available and much cheaper to the general public. So as a craftsman himself, making a wooden table like this would probably cost a lot more than some of the cheap metal card tables that were beginning to be produced around this same period, and will cost a fraction of the price. But the difference was that when you had something that was crafted by hand, like this wooden table, it was something that you could pass down as an heirloom for generations and would have a very long life because of its craftsmanship, which was not the case with many of the works that we see coming out of the factories of the Industrial Revolution. And tables and other wooden objects were just the same. As craftsmen were replaced by machines, you would not see types of crates like this, a chest for luggage or storage of various objects as you could open this, but we can see the detail that the craftsmen place into this object with all the tinted lacquers that have color to add to the surface of the wood, the handcrafted metal hardware that even have gems, amethyst, and ivory inset into the metalwork. A lot of attention has been paid to the detail of this work, which artists like Marie Zimmerman and Gustav Stickley that we were just looking at in the last slide noted that this was something that was changing the way that the world existed, buying cheap objects that were assembled in thousands as opposed to handcrafted, sometimes one-of-a-kind objects created by a craftsman. So here is just some more handcrafted woodwork. In this case, we have something that can be placed on the body. Jewelry as wood can be crafted into, in this case, in a necklace form. And you have rare materials being added to this, gold leaf being added to the surface, and to add some surface detail there on this form. Speaking of surface detail, carving, in the case of a functional object here, you've got some furniture by Judy Kensley McKee. Here's a piece of more sculptural work that pays homage to the roots of woodworking in the crafting of furniture. But with this object by Joran Verhoeven, you can see that this table is not functional. You couldn't very easily pull up chairs and eat at it, but it is being attributed in form to the traditional history of decorative woodworking with regard to furniture. So most of those objects that we just looked at were examples of assemblage. So we're assembling wood, putting the pieces together with hardware, oftentimes made of metal. With turning, you're working in a 360-degree radially symmetrical way, just like you do with the potter's wheel with ceramics. But with regard to turning, you're using a lathe. And I normally point you guys to the wood turner Gene Gillespie here, who is up at Spruce Forest by Penn Alps Restaurant in Garrett County, and their shops were just had a lot of damage from a windstorm, and it wouldn't be open with the quarantine right now. But in the way that Gene works, he is turning this piece of wood and then carving away at it with steel tools as it spins. So what you end up with in the end is a radially symmetric vessel form. So you can see this bowl here could be filled with just about anything. So our last materials that we want to talk about here, ivory, jade, and lacquer, that come up in the chapter, are just a few of the rare materials that we have worked as a species over the millennium. Ivory, I'm sure you know, comes from mammals, either in the form of tusks or sometimes teeth of the various species that it can be harvested from, and is now in the form of elephant ivory, especially illegal for trade around the world. But we have looked at some jade objects so far in the semester, carvings from Mesoamerica, the Mayan culture especially. But lacquer we really haven't discussed, and some of you might know what lacquer is if you think about various treatments for wood to preserve them and make the life last longer. But the first one that we want to talk about is ivory. Like I said, sometimes this is coming from elephant tusk. I've also seen carvings that were made from whale's teeth when the harvest of that animal was more common in the prior centuries. But in this case, you can see, just like with a carving in wood, it usually bears the resemblance of the original form of the material that you started with. So with wooden objects, they're oftentimes cylindrical because of the nature of the shape of a tree trunk. In the case of ivory, that's also true. The cylindrical form that we see here is a cross-section cut from the tusk itself. But you can see that it does lend itself to be carved in a lot of detail all of these reliefs and textures that have been carved into the ivory itself. So here's another ivory object. It is functional. It's a vessel. If you look up to the top here, around this little seam, that is where the lid connects to the base of the object. But very, very much detail added to carve this work here. But again, keep in mind the shape of the original tusk in that cylindrical form that they grow in. The objects can usually be identified by that cylindrical nature that they still have. So jade we have discussed. Here's a Mayan effigy figure used in ceremonial practice that we see coming from the Olmec. In this case, when we're carving this, we talked about it in the previous chapter also with figurative sculpture, that if you were carving into jade, it's harder than steel, and you have to use friction and abrasion to be able to cut into it or drill holes into it. This was a very, very time-consuming process to be able to carve these figurines here. But oftentimes it's thought of as being green, especially with the Mesoamerican cultures, the Olmec and the Maya. They were looking at the sacred cenotes, which were sinkholes in the limestone, and associated the color of jade, which you can see a little bit of whenever you look down into one of these watery holes that they believed were the entrance to the underworld in their religion. The color of jade they associated with the water in those spaces. So it was thought to be a holy material. But if you go on the complete opposite side of the world, looking at jade carving in China, they also have a rich history of that. You get a little bit of color variation because of the variance of the mineral deposits themselves in a different continent here. But looking at some of these areas that have blue and some even brown sometimes mixed in with that green. So lacquer is our last one here, and when we're talking about lacquer, I mentioned you probably have heard of it. Sometimes you're making this out of a synthetic form like polyurethane in modern times, but originally lacquer is being derived from tree sap. But when you apply this to the surface of the wood, it protects it, it makes it last for a lot longer, it makes it resistant to water, especially in the form of these Chinese boxes that are lacquered. They would be lacquered with so many layers that you would eventually make the box next to airtight, so some of them could even float in water. But as you can see here, also we're saying that it takes sometimes many coats brushing on to apply this lacquer to be able to finish your surface here. And what that gave the artisans the chance to do was to put gold, and in this case mother of pearl, even some silver in the material itself, and then keep lacquering over the top of that. So you basically trapped your rare materials, the gold and the mother of pearl there and the shell, in that surface. So here's just one more example where we can see lacquer. As they've gone through and coated the lacquer on, you've painted this scene, so adding pigments to be trapped in the lacquer. And even along the edge, if you can see here, there are little granules of silver and gold, like with the granulation technique that we were looking at in the metal section just prior to this. So fiber was the last major section on the list, and as we discussed at the very beginning of the lecture, this one also is ancient. As long as people have been cold or have been beaten by the sun on a hot day in the summer, it is nice to have fibers to be able to protect us. So one way to think about it is using plant fibers, like weaving together reeds to make a hat, or something to protect you from above. Another way to think about it is weaving the strands of animal hair in that other natural application to put on us to keep us warm in the winter or overnight. But they can come from multiple natural sources, animals or plants. But think about in the modern sense in the 21st century where we're at now, how many synthetic fibers we have, like nylons and polyesters, that are unnatural forms of fiber. We've got many examples of fiber not just being used for clothing and to protect us from the elements on our bodies, but also using them as vessels, as has been the case with many of these media: glass, ceramic, metal, something that you can put objects inside of. And with regard to these bowls, it's not just about the tradition of making the bowl itself, but passing down a narrative or telling a story, maybe a story of creation or the history of the people, but giving the people who are learning, the next generation who are learning how to do this craft, passing that story down through this process of making. So we have many examples of that, especially in African culture, and I'm going to give you another extra credit from Craft in America on PBS about basket weaving also, and that narrative storytelling that we're talking about here. But this is not to say that, like when we were talking in the 21st century, when these craftspeople start to try to get their work accepted for not just its functionality, that people could not make sculptural objects out of this basket weaving process also. So you have Munden Kogyuku here making this bamboo basket, but as you can tell when you look into the center of it, this is not functional anymore. Like the entire portion of the vessel that would be able to have things placed inside of it is closed, and it is just to be appreciated for its sculptural form. But do remember when we're talking about these techniques that many of the forms of textiles that you use on a daily basis, whether that's a blanket or a sweatshirt or what have you, have been woven. So one way to work fabric would be to felt. When you're making felt or felting fibers, they are matted together, versus the more organized way of arranging them with weaving, where we have the warp and the weft, as we talked about in the painting chapter when we got to tapestries and making images out of textiles at the end of that chapter. But the warp, always remember, is your fiber that is going in a straight pattern vertically or horizontally away from you, as we have with the different kinds of looms that we weave on. But the warp fibers are not the ones that where all the color is coming from. All of your color in the design is coming from the weft. So here we see a loom, and you can see the warp fibers are straight out in front of her in a vertical formation, and then as she's going through with these horizontal fibers, the weft, that is where all of that design is coming from. You're not seeing these fibers from the warp being displayed in the final pattern that's being represented there. So this is another one that we have rich history with First Nations people in North America, also across Africa, having rich cultural presence, and in South America also with the Incas in Peru that we see with these weavings here out of wool and cotton. So you're taking the animal fibers and the natural plant fibers and combining them in this work on a loom. But just thinking back again, this is the warp, and all of the color that's making the pattern is the weft that is woven across there. So slightly varied from that process, weaving on a loom, is knotting. The Persian knot that you can see here Thinking about Persian rugs, you might have heard of those before, and they're very expensive because of the amount of knots here. So this one is a 34-foot rug, and you have about 300 knots per square inch. So it's almost like making pixels out of this textile here. But what's in total, you have around 12 million knots that have been tied in the fiber to make this pattern in the textile that we see here. So we have other weavings. This one's coming from China and Japan, where you have silk being woven in a much more detailed fashion here. And this is still something that we have presence of culturally today in textile arts, fiber arts. And we can't forget about quilting either. I'm sure some of you have grandmothers that probably still do this, taking and sewing various bits and scraps of fiber, sometimes working figuratively, making an image out of your quilting, but sometimes just making more of an abstract representation here on this quilt, but it's still all fiber in its material. So this is not to say that in the 21st century we don't still have artists using fiber as their medium, like yarn here, who are then also pushing that border between where art and craft are separated. So trying to make something like knitting and using yarn to create textile with, to create something more than that, more of a sculpture. So we also have artists like Ellen Otsway who are weaving other kinds of materials into their works using plastic and copper wire from computer parts, pieces of aluminum, and really making textiles in the traditional way, but using materials that now can get his hands on. A lot of this coming from recycled sources. And then we've got to throw in the yarn bombers here at the end, using yarn to be able to decorate the surfaces and structures, in this case like wrapping trees, and in the case of yarn bombing here, the bull on the Wall Street Stock Exchange. So make sure to keep an eye out in announcements for your extra credit assignments on some of these craft medium, and we'll see you on the next one, which is our final chapter on 13 on architecture.